Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Sonali Gokhale, and on behalf of Procter Gamble, it's a privilege and pleasure to introduce the speaker, Dr. Rajesh Parikh. He is the Director of Medical Research and Honorary Neuropsychiatrist at the Jaslok Hospital and Research Center, Mumbai, as well as Adjunct Professor of Psychiatry at the Carver School of Medicine, Iowa. Dr. Parikh trained and taught at the Johns Hopkins Medical Institution in the US and at the King Edward Memorial Hospital in Mumbai. He has published research in leading international journals. He's passionate about poetry, painting, photography, philosophy, linguistics, marine fish, and aviation. Dr. Parikh has cumulatively won over 200 awards in academics and in his diverse activities. Recently, he has authored two best-selling books, The Coronavirus: What You Need to Know About the Global Pandemic by Penguin Random House, and another, The Vaccination Book. Welcome, Dr. Parikh, and over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Sonali Gokhale, for your kind words of introduction. I am delighted to be with you today to share with you some thoughts on a topic that has been dear to my personal and professional life over the past 2 years: how to ride the pandemic's waves. Over these past 2 years, all of us have seen our personal and professional lives turned around in a dramatic manner. And in the course of this presentation, I would like to share with you some ideas on how we can not only cope with the pandemic, not only master it, but by developing resilience, enjoy the challenges the way surfers do when they face enormous waves. And we should look at strategies which are emotional, cognitive, and behavioral. And as we develop these strategies, we shall certainly be successful and possibly even enjoy riding the pandemic's waves. Now, the big question that we are all asking ourselves is, when will this pandemic end? When we look at what happened with the previous pandemics, we see that they all lasted about a year, going back to the Spanish influenza, which was a devastating pandemic of 100 years ago, far bigger in scale than what we are witnessing today. And the other two pandemics have also been about a year. And the current pandemic has now gone on relentlessly for 2 years. And the question mark at the end clearly indicates that we do not know. While we are dealing with the current pandemic, all around us is a parallel pandemic, which has been termed as the mental health pandemic. And in fact, WHO estimates that the next big pandemic following on the footsteps of this pandemic, whenever it ends, is going to be the mental health pandemic. And in the following graph, we see that data from across the world, from multiple countries, shows us that people are grappling with stress, anxiety, and depression. Perhaps it might provide us some solace to realize that we are not alone in dealing with the pandemic. When we look at data on anxiety, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, we see that there has been a dramatic increase across the world. And it is the same story when we look at the data on depression. When we look at the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on our professional lives, we see that, first of all, over the past 2 years, more than 50% of people across the world have moved to working from home. While initially this might have seemed a great idea, after all, one doesn't have to deal with the problems of commuting, over time, data indicates that 57% of people dislike working from home. And moreover, over 75% of people working from home have astonishingly developed burnout. It's perhaps understandable that when the boundaries between work and home get blurred, as has been happening increasingly more often in the past 2 years, people are bound to experience varying degrees of burnout at home. And this in turn has impacted job satisfaction, job motivation, and even company satisfaction. Moreover, across the world, 44% of people who are working from home are reporting a decline in their mental health. Over 100 years ago, two psychologists, Robert Yerkes and John Dodson, researched the relationship between stress and performance. And in 1908, they published their work, and it has now come to be known as the Yerkes-Dodson law, which shows that as stress levels increase, our performance also increases up to a point where we have optimal stress and optimal performance. But any further increase in stress thereafter leads to a progressive decline in performance, leading to disorganization. And behavioral occupational psychologists have, over the past few decades, tried to create a work environment which leads to optimal stress and optimal performance. And if we develop the strategies for resilience, then we can ensure that we are by and large in this zone of optimal stress and optimal performance. Effective strategies to enable us to ride the pandemic waves are broadly emotional strategies, cognitive strategies, and behavioral strategies. Let us take a look at some of the emotional strategies that we can develop to build resilience. Breathing is something that happens all the time without our knowledge, but I think we are all aware that when we are stressed, our rate of breathing and depth of breathing get altered. What many of us do not know, that the relationship is also in the other direction, which means that if we control our breathing, we can control our levels of stress. And pranayam, which is the breathing component of yoga, has demonstrated this over thousands of years. And lately, mindfulness, which is a combination of breathing, of meditation, and certain Buddhist practice, has become popular all over the world to enable people to deal with stressful situations and can therefore help us to deal with the pandemic. And then, of course, there are the distraction strategies. We've all deployed them at some point or the other, going back to childhood. And we know that if we just watch a film or talk to somebody on the phone as a way of distracting ourselves from stress, it does show some short-term benefits, but clearly it's not a practice that's conducive to building up long-term resilience. The cognitive strategies to build resilience consists of harnessing our thought processes by developing adequate knowledge, because at the end of the day, knowledge is power. With so much of false information going around, particularly from lobbies such as those of anti-vaxxers, it's important for us to have adequate knowledge in dealing with this pandemic. It is important for us to realize that while we are physically distanced and isolated due to this pandemic, thanks to technology developed even before the pandemic, we can be socially connected with each other. We can talk to each other. We can allow the relationships that we value to blossom. We can enhance our skills of empathy, which is quite simply the ability to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to see the world from their point of view, to get away from our own burdens and understand what other people are going through, can help us to feel better and to also get a different perspective on what we are going through and thereby build resilience. And of course, having discussions with those whose opinions we value, the people who are close to us, can help us to understand not only their concerns, but also our own concerns. They can mirror to us whether our thoughts are rational, whether they are based on facts, or whether they are based on beliefs. Sometimes in all of us, strong beliefs can transgress into an area which becomes delusional, and then we can get stuck in a certain position rather than be free enough to ride the pandemic waves. And also for us to be focused on solutions rather than be entrenched in problems. The behavioral strategies to develop resilience consist of the things that we can actually do to make ourselves healthier, happier, and stronger. Above all, these comprise self care, exercise, sleep, nutrition. The past 2 years have provided me with a tremendous opportunity to regulate my sleep, exercise, and diet. And having lost 27 pounds, I feel healthier, lighter, not just physically, but spiritually and as a way of being. And this, of course, involves developing a routine. And, one of them is restricting news. We talked about knowledge as power, but trying to get too much information at the expense of looking after ourselves can take a toll on our resilience. And I was guilty of this in the first 2 months of 2020. I was constantly looking up medical journals several times a day. And then I realized that this was consuming a disproportionate amount, not only just of my time, but my mental energy as well. And it took an effort to regulate it, but it has been well worth it. Altruism, which is again getting away from ourselves, from our own emotional problems, in helping others. Sometimes it's helping somebody with their grief. It could be helping somebody with getting an ICU bed. It can take various forms. But again, research studies have time and again shown that caring for other people, going outside of ourselves, can be a good way to build resilience. And then finally, it's also making the most of a situation. We're stuck at home. We can use this time to develop hobbies. I have scaled up my reading considerably. There were so many books which were lying around. I always thought I'd get around to reading them. The pandemic has provided that opportunity. For some, it is the films that we've been wanting to watch, TV, whatever. And even attend webinars and listen to talks such as this, which I hope are not stressful for you. So there are multiple ways in which we can develop resilience. Let us now look at some people who through history have ridden pandemic waves and done so with dramatic success. They can inspire us. They've certainly inspired me to develop resilience during the pandemic. During the plague of the 16th century, which was far more devastating, not only than the COVID-19 pandemic, but more than anything that we can imagine, a huge proportion of the population of Europe perished. And during this time, in the isolation that was imposed on people, Shakespeare and Newton produced some of their most important works. Shakespeare wrote 3 very important plays: Macbeth, King Lear, Antony and Cleopatra, and those of whom love Shakespeare, and I count myself as one of them, can see traces of the pandemic through these plays. Newton used this time to develop laws that change our understanding of the world and which continue to influence us today. The laws of gravity, those of optics, calculus, and the laws of motion. And here are just 2 examples of people who have been able to ride the pandemic waves successfully and continue to inspire us even today. I too, in my own small way, have been able to harness the time given to me during the pandemic to do things which otherwise would not have been possible. So in January of 2020, I was invited to a plenary session of the Indian Psychiatric Society along with my dear friend Ram Ranga, who has been the Mental Health Commissioner for Delaware. And we used the time after the conference to go on the Ganga in search of the elusive Sundarbans tiger. And while the internet there was intermittent, we began to follow articles that were appearing in medical journals such as the Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine on what was happening in Wuhan. And I then realized that a pandemic was on its way. I got back to the Jaslok Hospital and Research Center, where I have been for the past 30 years. And in my capacity as Director of Research, addressed the directors in a meeting on the 4th of February 2020 and warned them of what we might expect. I got around to preparing a protocol for our hospital. In fact, we were the first hospital in the country to be ready for COVID-19 by early March of 2020. And that protocol metamorphosed into a book which was published by Penguin Random House and became a national bestseller. That motivated me to work on another book which was published in January of 2021 on vaccination. That too, fortunately, became a national bestseller. It has led to other books. And during the pandemic, I was able to enact an idea that I had been ruminating on for some time, which is why not introduce mental health into the curriculum the way we have physical health. And we used this time along with my co-authors, Munira Kapadia and Mahira Desai, two brilliant psychologists, to write a series of books for primary school, grade 1 to 5. In addition to that, because I wrote the books on COVID-19 and vaccination, by proxy, I became some kind of an expert who was much sought after by the media, and have done over 450 TV interviews in which I have tried to share my knowledge with people to allay their apprehensions. So the pandemic has transformed my life too. And of course, one of the consequences of that is that I get the opportunity to chat with you today on how to develop resilience. And finally, here is a story of resilience which could inspire all of us. In the late 1920s, we are all aware, there was the Great Economic Depression in the United States. That was an economic disaster which on scale could be compared to the medical, social and economic disaster that we are facing nearly 100 years later in the COVID-19 pandemic. During that time, businesses suffered. There was a small company then which primarily manufactured soap. Its business too was affected. And a group of people got together and brainstormed and thought that they perhaps needed to advertise on radio. The problem was not too many people were interested in listening to the radio either. So they devised a method by which a story would continue on and on into various programs so that people would get curious and hooked on to watching these programs. And that was the birth of the soap opera. In fact, that's why it's called the soap opera, because the sole purpose of the serial radio programs was to sell the soap of this company. And then, of course, we've had television serials, modern soap operas, leading to corporations like Netflix. And, that company grew, it developed resilience, it thrived after that disaster, and today has become the largest company in the world for packaged consumer goods. You probably know that company, Procter Gamble. It's been a pleasure to chat with you, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope that some of the strategies that we have discussed, the figures through history who have inspired us, and more important, the history of your own company, Procter & Gamble, will inspire you to develop resilience and successfully, and I might add, even enjoyably, ride the pandemic waves. Merry Christmas. God bless.